There's a moment in every royal story when silence becomes louder than any headline. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind that follows pressure, scrutiny, and decisions made behind closed doors when no cameras are allowed. Because in the world of royalty, what you don't say can matter far more than what you do. And right now, that silence is surrounding one name, Princess Eugenie. For 7 years, she stood behind a cause that carries weight far beyond palace walls. A cause built not on tradition, but on truth. A fight against exploitation, against human trafficking, against one of the darkest realities still existing in the modern world. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't symbolic. It was real. And for years, she gave it her voice, her platform, her presence. But then, without warning, she stepped away. No dramatic announcement, no emotional statement, no clear explanation, just a quiet exit. And that's where the real story begins. Because when someone in her position walks away from something that's significant, it's rarely simple, it's rarely random, and it's almost never without a reason that many believe leads back to a shadow that has refused to disappear. A shadow tied to one of the most controversial figures in modern royal history, Prince Andrew. For years, his name has carried weight inside the monarchy. But in recent times, that weight has turned into something far heavier. A burden, a controversy, a stain that doesn't stay contained. Because in the royal family, nothing stays contained. Every connection matters. Every association is examined. And every decision is questioned, especially when it involves a cause like this. Because the organization Eugenie was part of is not just another charity. Anti-Slavery International is one of the oldest human rights organizations in the world. Founded in 1839, its mission has remained unchanged for nearly 2 centuries: to expose, to fight, and to end modern slavery in all its forms. From forced labor to trafficking networks hidden in plain sight, it is a cause built on credibility, on trust, on moral authority, and in a world where perception matters just as much as action. Even the smallest controversy can become a problem. So when a royal figure connected, directly or indirectly, to one of the most talked about scandals, stands as a public face of that mission, the pressure begins to build, quietly at first, then louder, then impossible to ignore. And that's exactly what seems to have happened here. Because while Eugenie maintained composure in public, while appearances remained calm, measured, controlled, behind the scenes, the reality may have been very different. Sources began to suggest that the weight of association, the constant connection back to her father's controversy, was becoming harder to separate from her work. And in a cause where public trust is everything, that connection can't be ignored. Not by the media, not by critics, and not by the organizations themselves. Because for them, this isn't about titles. It's about impact. And even the perception of conflict can threaten everything they stand for. So a decision had to be made. Not loudly, not dramatically, but carefully, strategically, and perhaps reluctantly. A step back, a quiet exit, a move designed not to create headlines, but to avoid them. And yet, it did the opposite. Because the moment she stepped away, the question started. Was it voluntary? Was it necessary? Or was it inevitable? Because this isn't just about one role or one decision. It's about what it reveals, about the modern royal reality, where personal identity is never fully separate from family legacy, where your actions are never judged in isolation, and where even the most genuine intentions can be reshaped by circumstances beyond your control. For Eugenie, this may be one of those moments, a moment where loyalty meets responsibility, where personal belief meets public perception, and where doing the right thing isn't always clear. Because stepping down doesn't always mean stepping away. It can mean protecting something, preserving something, or even sacrificing something. And that's what makes this story so complex, so layered, and so difficult to ignore. Because behind the calm exterior, behind the carefully managed silence, there's a deeper question waiting to be answered. Not just about what happened, but about why. Why now? Why after 7 years? And why in this moment, when the spotlight feels heavier than ever? To understand that, we have to go deeper, back to where it all connects, back to the moments that shape the narrative, and back to the controversy that continues to cast its shadow across everything. Because in the royal family, the past never really stays in the past. It follows, it lingers, and sometimes it forces decisions that change everything. Because to understand why this moment matters, you have to understand what it means to live inside a system where identity is never entirely your own, where your name carries history, where your choices carry consequences, and where your family is never just your family. For Princess Eugenie, that reality has always been present, but rarely has it felt this visible, or this heavy, because long before this quiet exit, long before the headlines and speculation, her story was already being shaped by forces she didn't create. She was never positioned as a central royal figure, never groomed for the crown, never expected to carry the full weight of the monarchy the way figures like Prince William were. Instead, she existed in that complex space, close enough to be recognized, but distant enough to remain on the edges, a position that offers freedom, but also uncertainty, because when you're not at the center, you're often left to define your own role. And that's exactly what she tried to do, not through grand gestures, but through quieter choices, education, career, charity work, building an identity that felt separate from royal expectations, while still respecting the institution she was born into. And for a time, it worked. She became known for causes that felt personal, authentic, grounded in real-world issues rather than ceremonial appearances. Her involvement with Anti-Slavery International was part of that, a role that wasn't about visibility, but about impact, because modern slavery is not a distant issue. It exists in supply chains, in hidden networks, in places most people never see, and bringing attention to it requires more than just a title. It requires credibility, consistency, and trust. For years, Eugenie seemed to embody that. Her speeches weren't rehearsed performances. They carried a sense of genuine concern, a connection to the cause that felt real. And that authenticity mattered, because in the world of charity work, people can tell the difference. They can tell when someone is simply representing a cause, and when they actually believe in it. But belief alone isn't always enough. Not when external factors begin to shift the narrative. Not when public perception starts to change. And certainly not when your personal story becomes entangled with something much bigger. Because while Eugenie was building her own path, another story was unfolding, one that would eventually intersect with hers, in ways no one could ignore. The story of Prince Andrew, once a prominent figure within the royal family. His position, influence, and reputation seemed firmly established. But over time, that image began to fracture. Allegations, associations, and a series of events that pulled his name into global controversy. The kind of controversy that doesn't fade quickly. The kind that follows every mention, every appearance, every connection. And in a family as visible as the British monarchy, that kind of attention spreads. It doesn't stay contained. It reaches outward, touching everyone connected to it, including his daughters, including Eugenie. At first, the impact was subtle. A mention here, a question there, the occasional headline linking one story to another. But as time passed, those connections became harder to ignore, because when a scandal reaches a certain level, it stops being about one person. It becomes about the institution, the reputation, the image that the monarchy presents to the world. And in that environment, even the most well-intentioned roles can become complicated, especially when those roles involve causes built on moral authority. Because organizations like Anti-Slavery International operate on trust, on the belief that those who represent them reflect the values they stand for. And while Eugenie's personal commitment may never have been in question, the external perception began to shift, quietly at first. Then more noticeably, questions started to emerge, not necessarily about her actions, but about the optics, the association, the connection that critics could point to, whether fairly or not. And in today's media landscape, perception can become reality, because once a narrative takes hold, it's difficult to control, difficult to reshape, and nearly impossible to ignore. For the organization, this presents a challenge, not a personal one, but a structural one. because their mission depends on credibility, on being seen as uncompromised, unquestioned, focused entirely on the cause. And any distraction, any controversy, even indirect, can become a risk. So decisions have to be made, carefully, quietly, and often privately, which brings us back to that moment, the decision to step down. After 7 years, no public explanation, no detailed reasoning, just a statement of gratitude, and a change that spoke for itself. To some, it may seem routine, a natural transition, the end of one chapter, but to others, it feels more significant, more deliberate, because timing matters, context matters, and when you place this decision within the larger narrative, it becomes harder to see it as coincidence. Instead, it begins to look like something else, a response, a calculation, a recognition that sometimes stepping away is the only way to protect what you care about, because staying might create more questions than answers, and in a role tied to a cause as sensitive as this, questions can be damaging, not just for the individual, but for the mission itself. So the choice becomes clear, even if it's difficult, even if it's personal, even if it means letting go of something you supported for years. And that's what makes this moment so compelling, because it's not just about what happened, it's about what it represents. A glimpse into the reality of modern royalty, where tradition meets scrutiny, where personal values meet public pressure, and where every decision carries layers of meaning beyond what's visible on the surface. For Eugenie, this may not be the end of her involvement in causes like this. In fact, the organization itself suggested that her support could continue in other ways, less visible, less formal, but still present, because stepping down from a title doesn't erase commitment. It simply changes how that commitment is expressed. And perhaps that's the path forward, a way to continue supporting the cause, without the weight of official association, without the scrutiny that comes with a public role, a quieter form of advocacy, one that exists outside the spotlight, but still contributes to the same goal. And yet, even with that possibility, the questions remain, because this story doesn't exist in isolation. It connects to something larger, a broader shift within the monarchy itself, a moment where change is not just expected, but necessary, where figures like Prince William are reportedly looking toward the future, thinking about how to reshape the institution, how to make it more relevant, more resilient, more aligned with modern expectations. And in that vision, every role matters, every decision contributes to the bigger picture, including this one, because when someone steps away, it creates space for change, for new directions, for different voices to emerge. And that's where the story begins to expand, beyond one individual, beyond one decision, into something much broader, a transformation, a recalibration of what it means to be royal in a world that no longer accepts tradition without question. And as that transformation unfolds, moments like this become more than just headlines. They become signals, indicators of a system adjusting to new realities, trying to balance history with progress, stability with change, and public expectation with private complexity. Which brings us to the next layer of this story, because while Eugenie's decision may appear quiet on the surface, the ripple effects are anything but, and what happens next may reveal far more about the future of the royal family than anyone is currently prepared for. It began, as many defining royal moments do, not with a dramatic announcement, but with silence. No grand statement, no flashing cameras, no carefully staged appearance on palace steps, just a quiet shift that most people almost missed. After 7 years of standing behind one of the world's most respected humanitarian causes, Princess Eugenie stepped away from her role with Anti-Slavery International, and in doing so, she triggered a wave of questions that cut far deeper than a simple resignation. Because in the world she was born into, nothing is ever just a personal decision. Every move echoes, every silence speaks, and every step back reveals something the public was never meant to fully see. For years, Eugenie had built something rare within the modern monarchy, a reputation that felt authentic, not manufactured, not inherited, but earned. She wasn't the most visible royal. She wasn't constantly in headlines, But when she spoke about modern slavery, about exploitation hidden inside supply chains, about human trafficking networks operating in plain sight, people listened. Because it didn't sound like duty. It sounded like belief. And that's what made her departure feel different, not routine, not expected, but necessary. And when something becomes necessary inside the royal family, it usually means pressure has reached a point where silence is no longer enough. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand what Anti-Slavery International represents. Founded in 1839, it is not just a charity, it is one of the oldest human rights organizations in the world. It exists for one purpose, to confront systems of exploitation that most of the world would rather not look at. Forced labor, human trafficking, modern slavery hidden behind polished corporate fronts. It is not a symbolic cause. It is a confrontational one. And that means credibility is everything. The people who represent it cannot just be supportive. They must be beyond question. Because the moment doubt enters a conversation, the mission itself becomes vulnerable. And that is where the shadow begins to fall. Because no matter how carefully Princess Eugenie built her identity, she was never building it alone. She was building it while standing inside one of the most scrutinized families in the world. A family where history is not past, it is present, and where controversy does not fade. It lingers. Her father, Prince Andrew, remains one of the most controversial figures in modern royal history. His association with Jeffrey Epstein, a convicted sex offender tied to global trafficking networks, did not just create headlines. It created a stain, a lasting, complicated, deeply uncomfortable stain that no amount of time has fully erased. And while Eugenie was never part of that story, she was never completely separate from it either. Because in the royal world, proximity is power, but it is also risk. And when public attention sharpens, as it inevitably does, those risks begin to expand outward, touching people who had no role in the original controversy. That is the hidden cost of royal identity. You do not choose every part of your